Hello and welcome to our 2016 Hutchinsons maize trial site. We're here on one of the hottest September days since 1929, and that's been very influential this year because the maize crop was drilled on this very light land site here at Great Livermere near Bury St Edmunds on the 22nd of April into wet and cold conditions, and it looked like the crop was going to be behind. And then we find ourselves here in September when actually it's reached an impasse in its maturity. Whilst we're still looking at varieties, we've now expanded the site so that we're also looking at several other important agronomic factors in growing the maize crop. These include soil, row spacings and nutrition, and obviously combining all of those together to maximise the performance of the crop.
This has been an extraordinary year. The site has had over 3,000 heat units, 12% greater than their 10-year average, and a lot of that has been delivered in the last 3 or 4 weeks. So it's no surprise to see the crop heavily desiccated now. Why is that important? It's because growers need to make the right decisions to maximise their production and choose a variety that suits both their soil type, their elevation, nutrition, and not least of which the management system, especially for AD producers, where this crop has to fit in amongst the other rotational requirements for the farm business.
The choice of varieties that growers have for maize is very large and can be confusing. So the purpose of our trials through the last 3 years has been to select a more simplified approach and show some reliability. P7326 from Pioneer is an extra early variety with an FAO of 160. It's the fastest Pioneer hybrid to reach 30% dry matter. Very good early vigour and is widely adaptable to a lot of different growing circumstances. P7378 is very early rather than extra early with an FAO of 170. It was new for 2017, but we did look at this in the trial for 2016. And it has an exceptionally high dry matter capacity for what is a very early variety, but it would seem perhaps not particularly suited to the heaviest of soils. P7892 has an early rating with an FAO 170 and is one of our most consistent performers because we've seen this over 3 consecutive years, and in that respect I'd call this fairly bomb-proof for a lot of different circumstances and totally reliable. It's fair to say that KWS have led the way with industry standards, and Fabregas would be a good example of this. It's a main crop variety with an FAO of 220, but has been widely grown, but really needs careful placement in seasons which are unpredictable. Severus is an earlier variety with an FAO of 170, but has shown itself to produce lower metabolizable energy levels than the ones that you've seen previously. Index has proven to be one of the best from the later maturing varieties with an FAO of 240, but it stays green and continues to lay down metabolizable energy through its dry matter and has proven to be hugely reliable and very successful commercially. Mavana was introduced in 2016, a leading variety in Germany, not quite as late as Index with an FAO of 200, but shows good promise. Finally, Mallory from Limagrain unusually has coloured seeds in its cob. It's an intermediate maturity variety with good metabolizable energy production, especially in a dry year when it's almost topped our trials list. But again, we'd like to test this again in 2017 to check its reliability over different growing circumstances.
On my left here we've got what we call narrow row spacing, where we've drilled at 500mm, and on my right we've got conventional row spacing at 750mm. Some people ask, when you drill at narrower row spacings, will you compromise the root bore? I've dug up a couple of plants here and I think we have a fairly straightforward answer to that. On my left here we have a root bore which is of a good size, and on my right here we have the root bore from the conventional spacing which is of an equal size. In actual fact, you could probably say that from the narrower spacing this root bore is slightly larger. The other effect we've seen from narrow row spacing is less weeds and smaller weeds, whereas again in conventional row spacing we've had more weeds, and we have seen the weeds being bigger than the maize plant itself. And this is due to light interception. More light is able to hit the soil in the wider row spacings. As well as that, here on my left you'll actually see that the plant is green still from top to bottom, even in these incredibly hot conditions, which would suggest that the root is binding moisture within the soil and actually is able to retain that moisture and use it for longer. Whereas on my right with the conventional row spacing, you'll see that this plant has already senesced, so clearly the soil has dried out around these. We've also then had a look at the cobs. In my right hand here I have a cob from the conventional row widths, and you can see it's what we call nosed, which is where the plant has run out of nitrogen part of the way through its life cycle. On my left here we have a cob from the narrow row spacing, which you can see has formed perfectly from top to bottom. So again, the root ball has tied up the nutrients in the soil, and that has enabled access to those nutrients to complete the formation of the cob. You can see these two side by side. The cob's also significantly bigger from the narrow row spacing. There's also another factor to consider with the cobs here, and that is that in the narrow row spacing, within a metre length of the crop, I found 11 cobs, and in the conventional row spacing, within a metre length, I found 9 cobs. That's a considerable difference when you're looking at the energy going into the AD plant.
Here at the Great Livermere site, we've been investigating the use of narrow rows for the past 2 seasons. This is from this season, and we've already shown you in the field that the root balls are marginally larger where we plant them in the 500mm rows. This is demonstrated in these trays by looking at the roots as they move to depth as well, where we've got a greater amount of root getting to a greater depth in the area we've planted at 500mm rows. The reason we're looking at 500mm rows is that we were seeing in the 750mm plantings that we were just not getting full root coverage of the soil between the rows, with around 15% of the field being underutilised. At 500mm rows we can see that the roots pass all the way across between the rows and meet in the centre, engaging with all the nutrition and all the available moisture within the soil, and we've seen that this has been giving us an increase in dry matter harvested.
I'm in a block of Pioneer P7892 where I'm looking at crop nutrition, and crop nutrition is critical to the maize plant. It's known as the hungry crop and requires large amounts of nutrition throughout its growing period. In terms of nitrogen, the crop requires half of its nitrogen in the later stages of its growth cycle. So what we're looking at here in particular is ways of managing that nitrogen so that the crop has access to the nitrogen later on in its life. In this particular area of the plot, I've got an untreated block to my left and I've got a treated block to my right. I've taken a couple of plants from each plot, from the untreated plot and the treated plot. This is the untreated plot. This plant here you can see has got a relatively small root mass, reasonably shallow rooted as well, so this plant is likely only to be taking a small amount of crop nutrition from the soil. On my right, the crop that was treated with N-Lock has got a much bigger root ball and many more roots that are getting access to that nutrition in the soil. When we look then at the cobs on those plants, on the treated plant we're getting much bigger cob size. On the untreated plant we're getting a much smaller cob size. And when we have a look at them, you can also see that this cob from the untreated side has only filled to about 3/4 to 7/8 of the way along the cob. If I pick up one from the treated side, you can see that the cob typically in that plot are filling right to the end. So we're getting 100% grain fill here from these plants.
We've looked at water infiltration along with the change in row width using both the mini disc and a pipe infiltration test. With the pipe infiltration test, we've been measuring up to 90% improvements in water infiltration in the centre of the rows. This is a massive increase, and that water is passing all the way to depth, so we're storing water for use by the crop later in the growing season, which is vitally important in these light soils for maintaining that crop later in the season as those soils dry. The mini disc infiltration test actually measures the soil's ability to move water through the micropores that we've created or are creating with the roots that we've got growing in the soil. And what we're seeing with the difference between the 750 and the 500mm rows is, as I've indicated, a much better infiltration rate of water, but the soil is able to store that water to an increase of around 33%. So again, a massive improvement in water management within these lighter soils to the benefit of the crop later in the season. With the pipe infiltration test, what we were seeing is that on the 750mm rows, where there's no roots between the centres of the rows, the water penetrates to around 2 inches of soil and then starts to spread through the upper surface of the soil. Wets the upper surface very rapidly, and if rain then continues, that soil becomes extremely high risk for erosion and runoff. With the 500mm rows, with the interaction of roots in the soil, we're seeing rapid infiltration, so we've shown up to 90% increases, but that water also passes right down through the soil profile to depth, where it's stored in the micropores for use by the crop later in the season. Going back to 2015, a very different season. You can see that by the crop. We're looking at them at roughly the same time of year. So very green in 2015. And you can also see that between the rows and the 750 mils, we're just not reaching the centre with the root ball from the maize plants. So that centre area is largely going to waste in terms of crop being able to utilise moisture and nutrition within that area. You can also see that the blue dye is not travelling down into the subsoil, which is again confirmed by the infiltration test, and the soil is just slumping really badly where we try and infiltrate water using a large infiltration ring. Between the 500mm rows you can see a very different scenario. We've got roots all the way across between the two rows meeting in the centre. The soil doesn't slump when we try and infiltrate a large amount of water between those rows, and you can also see that the blue dye is travelling right down through the soil to the subsoil area in a nice controlled manner, giving us good water storage for use by the crop later in the season. And this is giving us an increase in dry matter yield.
I find looking at this site in detail, the learnings and the data we get from it, really useful when it comes to the planning meetings that I have with my clients at the early stages of next year, when we're looking at what we should do for best management and how to gain those extra few % out of the crop to put us ahead of everybody else. I hope you find the learnings from this site useful in the growing of your crop, and we at Hutchinsons look forward to growing your crop with you next year and moving it on further.